So why does Kirby Smart run the clock at the end of games? It's not maybe totally what you thought, but he does have an eye on the future here with this one. He talked about this with Paul Feinbaum last week in Destin. And normally when Georgia gets up, we've seen this from Mark Richt's time on. You watch and they grind the clock out. But the method to the madness for Kirby Smart coming in here in the near future is he thinks that the shortening of games in some way or another is going to lead to more games. And he's always been concerned about the load that each player is carrying, and the amount of tackles, the amount of miles per hour in a GPS run, any number of things. But he was talking the other day about the addition of a running clock after incomplete passes with in the first 13 what in the first 11 minutes of a quarter, for possibly the first 13 minutes of a quarter, just to just to keep the clock moving, and that would give you fewer plays, which means fewer tackles, fewer exposure to injury, fewer lots of things, and that perhaps could lead to an additional game each season, which is another thing it seems like he's in favor of, but with caveats. So one thing he was talking about in his time was how are we going to add another game in the SEC schedule. And he said, I'd like to add the game, but I want to do it more for the fans. Um, Fans come to our games, they want the best games. They want to see the SEC teams play the SEC teams. And his argument in all of this is that it's hard to have more games if we continue to play the games the way we're playing them right now. He said, I would love to tighten things up and have players have fewer snaps. That would mean more games are possible. And then he goes on to talk about a running clock after an incompletion because he said there are so many good rivalries in the SEC. I hope we don't lose them, which could be a signal that there's some pressure to go to the 1-7 or 1-8 scheduling model. Those would mean the elimination of Georgia Auburn every year. And I mean, look, I write about this in DAWGSTRUCTION, which is, um, I would encourage y'all to get it now because I'm running out of copies. I have to reorder them, and that's a whole thing. And I talk about Stetson Bennett and when he was little, wanting to play against Auburn, and he had played against Auburn. Remember the year before. But I write this is the game at Auburn will be Bennett's first true road test as starting quarterback. Do y'all remember that? It was his first real road game. The noise of 87,000 fans at Jordan-Hare Stadium would bring the likes of which Georgia players had not heard since surviving there 2 years ago, 21-14. It would be deafening. On the field, it was evident that the number two dogs were experiencing something they had not faced before in quite some time: noise in an unfriendly environment. Auburn's old stadium shook, and the plains seemed to tremble as usual. Playing at Auburn would be a fight. It is one of the most challenging environments in college football. Please make sure you're checking out DAWGSTRUCTION. The link is down below. And that game could go away. I mean, there's no question it could go away. The likelihood of it going away, I think, is one question that's still out there. I know for me, growing up in Atlanta, you had the Tech game and you had the Auburn game, and those were both huge monumental games. Florida was, of course, a big deal, but not the same way in Atlanta that those two games were. But losing that rivalry would be a sad statement, frankly. And that's why I think Kirby is talking about the work he's done on some committees trying to shorten games. And look, I track all of this stuff for whatever reason. And games are relatively long. When you think about a football game in college and you compare that to the NFL, the NFL games are quicker. There is a pace to them. Well, they after incomplete passes, uh, the clock stops. But when guys run out of bounds in the NFL, the clock begins quickly. Now it stops briefly. But for instance, last year, the national championship game, which was just a standard game, right? I mean, it didn't go into overtime. Georgia won by 16 points or whatever it was. So it was a a lopsided game, but that was a 3 hour and 41-minute game. The game against Tennessee, 3 hours and 47 minutes. Georgia's fastest game, I think, in some years was the Georgia Tech game, which didn't even hit 3 hours. It was 2 hours and 53 minutes. So why does all of this matter? Well, if you had more 3 hour games and fewer 3 hour and 45-minute games, you probably have fewer plays. You would probably have fewer ability to have injury. I mean, Mark Richt, when Mark Richt was the head coach of Georgia, one of the things he really got worried about were injuries on kickoffs specifically. And we see fewer and fewer kickoffs being returned. But there are not a lot of games that are under the 2 minute, excuse me, under the 3 hour mark in college football. That just doesn't happen anymore. And when you look, like, for instance, this past year, Tech, the most recent one before that was the South Carolina game in Columbia, which is kind of one of the creepiest games I've been to in a long time. That was 2 hours and 56 minutes. Same time for the Kentucky game in 2020. But there just aren't a lot of games that really are under the 3 hour, 10-minute mark. That's when most games go through. Most NFL games are completed right near the 3 hour mark. The college football, you're talking about 3 hours and 15 minutes. In the NFL, you're playing 17 games in a season. In a regular season in the SEC, you're playing 12 games, 12 times 15. Now, this is just, uh, let's just say 0.25 times 12. That is the equivalent of 3 more hours a year. So that's like playing 13 games. Okay. Now the plays themselves might not be that way, but this is Kirby's all of this math is Kirby's way of trying to hold some of these games that Georgia plays now. And that's gonna be a fight, because with Texas and OU coming into the game, coming into the league, um, the league is going to have to satisfy television partners, and in order to do that, they're going to have to sacrifice some games. The question is, which games are we sacrificing? Are we sacrificing Georgia, South Carolina, or are we sacrificing Georgia, Auburn? You're not going to sacrifice Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Auburn. Those games will be around forever. But, I personally view what Kirby's talking about as the ability to to add Texas A&M, to keep Georgia, Auburn, to keep either Alabama, LSU, or Alabama, Tennessee. I mean, these are games that need to exist. Otherwise, I mean, if you're just going to go to Georgia playing Missouri all the time, nobody's going to care. And for all Kirby talks about the consumer wants the good games. They want Georgia, Auburn. They want Texas A&M and Texas. They want, you know, Alabama, LSU. You can't do that consistently if you're doing a 7-1 or an 8-1 schedule modeling. So Kirby wants faster games, and that's the reason why.